There's a certain ache that doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't strike like thunder or wound like a blade. It builds quietly, moment by moment, through absences, through the spaces where words should have been, through the silence of a mailbox that stays empty, long after it should have sung. That was the ache I carried for weeks. My granddaughter's 15th birthday was approaching, an event I had counted the years toward. A day that meant more to me than anyone in that house would ever understand. Ever since my wife passed away 5 years ago, I'd clung to the small rituals that kept her memory alive. She had always adored planning parties. I could almost see her ghost moving from table to table, adjusting flower vases and rechecking silverware, even if she was no longer here to set anything in place. So I had imagined, perhaps naively, that I would be part of that day. Not to be the center of it, God knows I never needed that, but simply to be there, to sit at a quiet corner table and watch my granddaughter glow, to feel the echo of my wife's smile in her dress, her steps, her laughter. But the invitation never came. At first, I assumed it was an oversight, a delay in the mail, a forgotten envelope on a cluttered counter. Then, as days passed and guests whispered excitedly in the small town where news travels like wind through autumn leaves, I began to understand. My son had made a choice, and it was not one of forgetfulness. It was one of omission. He had excluded me not because of an argument, not because of any grave offense I had committed, but because I had become inconvenient, a relic, a shadow of the past he wanted to leave behind. I had always known that his relationship with me was strained, brittle in places, too tired to mend. Since his mother's funeral, he had grown distant, blaming me for decisions we had made together, projecting onto me the loss he never processed. But I never imagined that grief would rot into cruelty, that it would blind him so completely that he would rob his own daughter of the presence of the man who loved her mother more than life itself, who once built her dollhouse with hands still trembling from the funeral, who braided her hair with hands that once braided her mother's. That man, it seemed, no longer at a place. So I waited. Every morning, I checked the mailbox, more from routine than hope. I cleared my calendar, told my bridge group I might not attend, rescheduled my doctor's appointment. I even shined my old shoes. I found the tie my wife gave me, the deep blue one with the silver pin that matched her favorite earrings. It still smelled faintly of cedar and rose water, and when the final week arrived and still no invitation came, I understood that it wasn't coming, that I too was not coming, at least not as they expected. Grief takes many forms. Sometimes it cries, sometimes it rages, and sometimes it simply moves, quiet and methodical, like a man reading legal documents late at night, dialing numbers with calm precision, transferring funds with the focus of someone who has waited for a long time to be underestimated. I made no dramatic gestures. I posted no bitter letters. I didn't confront anyone. Instead, I met with my lawyer. I met with a woman named Clara who handled local event spaces. I signed papers and asked questions, took tours and took notes. I drank coffee in offices no one knew I visited. I wore neutral colors and drove my older car. And by the time the cake flavors were finalized and the seating chart was drafted, the very floor my son thought he stood upon had quietly shifted. But before all of that, before the plan, before the movement, I stood alone in my hallway, holding the envelope I had written months earlier. A letter to my granddaughter. A letter full of memories, stories about her grandmother, and small truths about family, love, and loss. I had meant to give it to her that night, perhaps with a silver locket, a quiet gift from the past. But now, the paper felt heavier, like a stone pressed into my chest. I knew it wouldn't be handed to her the way I imagined. Still, I kept it, because some messages deserve to wait, and some silences deserve to be broken. That week, As the town buzzed with news of the party, the most lavish the community center had seen in years, I kept to myself. I heard whispers at the grocery store. They say it's going to be held at the new venue out by the lake. Apparently the whole thing is top-tier catering, high-end photography, the works. I smiled. I even nodded in agreement. No one suspected. No one connected the dots. Because sometimes people see an old man and assume he's finished. They forget that age sharpens memory, that loss deepens resolve, that love, when wounded, doesn't fade, it focuses. And so, on the day of the celebration, I rose early. I dressed in my finest. I wrapped the gift I had chosen months earlier, a gift my wife had bought long ago and asked me to save for this very day. I drove slowly, not out of hesitation but with purpose. I parked down the road, far enough not to draw attention. I walked to the gate, where a young man in black eyed me with polite suspicion. "Name?" he asked. I gave it. He checked his list, his brow furrowed. "I'm sorry, sir. Your name's not on the list. This event is private." The list was finalized by Mr. Jonathan. I looked past him, through the open archway where lights twinkled and voices danced on the breeze. I could hear the clink of glasses, the distant laughter of teenagers, the click of camera shutters. My chest tightened, not with pain, but with recognition. This was what my wife would have loved. This was what I had made possible. And yet, I was a ghost to them, a name erased, a presence unwelcome. I looked at the security guard and smiled. "Of course," I said gently. "That makes sense." I turned around, walked back to my car, and sat behind the wheel. For a few moments, I didn't move. I just listened, to the trees rustling, to the faint echoes of a party built on absence. Then I exhaled slowly, because I knew what came next. They thought I had been excluded, but they didn't understand. The night had only just begun, and when the lights dimmed, when the candles were lit, and when they called for the man who made it all possible, then the true host would appear. Not from the guest list, but from the foundation beneath it. Because the thing about being erased is that it makes your return all the more unforgettable. I held the box tighter on my lap as the car slowed near the entrance. It wasn't wrapped in ribbons or garish paper, just a small, dark blue rectangle with the family crest etched faintly on the lid, a symbol forgotten by many in the bloodline, but not by me. Inside, a pendant, not of great monetary value, but crafted from the wedding bands of her late grandmother and me, melted down and reshaped into something new, something meant to carry the weight of both legacy and love. A quiet heirloom, speaking louder than applause, the kind of gift no one else could have given her. I had it made a year ago, long before the guest list, long before I suspected what they would do, because I believed, foolishly perhaps, that some things couldn't be severed. That blood, at least, was thicker than ego. I was wrong. When I stepped out of the car, the evening air was sharp with perfume and lake mist. The driveway shimmered with lights like stars caught in chandeliers, and soft music drifted through the trees. I adjusted my blazer and took one deep breath before approaching the gate. The security guard was tall, indifferent, flipping a clipboard like it contained secrets worth guarding with blood. He didn't look up when I greeted him, just asked for my name. I said it, clearly, with a dignity I'd worn all my life, through military ranks, boardroom negotiations, and hospital corridors. He paused, ran his finger down the page again, then looked up, his expression flat. "Your name's not on the list, sir," he said. "Guest list was finalized by Mr. Jonathan Marks. If you're not on it, I can't let you through." He spoke with professional detachment, not malice. But that didn't matter. The pain wasn't in the tone, it was in the fact that he had to say it at all. Behind him, I could see movement. Guests arriving, laughing, hugging. Aunts, cousins, old family friends I hadn't seen in years. One of them, my cousin Marcello, even made brief eye contact with me, then quickly looked away, whether from shame or complicity. I couldn't tell. Somewhere inside, my granddaughter's voice echoed faintly, calling out instructions, probably trying not to trip in those glass shoes her mother insisted she wear. I imagined her face lighting up as she looked around for familiar faces. I imagined her disappointment growing quietly when mine wasn't among them. If she noticed, if they let her notice, I didn't argue, didn't demand an exception. That wasn't my style. I thanked the guard for doing his job. He was, after all, just a hired pair of arms obeying a list drawn by a hand I once held when it was too small to hold anything back. Then I turned slowly, and as I walked back toward the car, a strange sensation settled in my chest. Not bitterness, not yet. Something closer to amusement, like watching a snake build a nest in your own boot and thinking, how clever of you to mistake this warmth for shelter. I laughed softly as I opened the car door, because they had planned this. Planned it with precision, arrogance, and perhaps even joy. They believed I'd find out too late, that I'd be crushed, broken, that I'd go home humiliated, erased. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that I had already been there. I had already walked those halls, already approved the floral contracts, already tasted the menu samples that they now served on silver trays. They didn't know that months ago, when this location had first been scouted by the party planners, a quiet transaction had taken place, a transfer of ownership, discreet and invisible, through a company shell, layered in legal silence. They didn't know that the name at the bottom of every vendor check, every maintenance invoice, every lease payment was mine, not out of pettiness, out of something far older, a desire to build things with roots, to anchor beauty to legacy. I sat in the car for a few minutes longer, the box still resting on my lap. The hum of the generator behind the venue whispered in the dark like a second heartbeat. Somewhere, music changed tempo. The celebration grew louder. And yet, the threshold they thought they were protecting had already been crossed. I didn't need to break in. I only needed to wait. For now, I turned the key in the ignition. Not to leave, but to reposition. There are many entrances to a place like this, some marked by velvet ropes, others carved by memory and ownership. I chose the latter. Tonight, they had pushed me away, but the wheels were already in motion. My silence had been building long before their rejection. And the moment they chose to leave me outside the gate, they unknowingly invited me into something far more powerful. A game of shadows, a ballet of consequences. I wasn't there to crash their party. I was there to remind them who had built the ground beneath their feet. The security guard watched me go, oblivious. But I smiled at him once more in the rearview mirror. Because soon, very soon, someone would whisper in his ear, ask who approved the last-minute kitchen changes, or why the master key stopped working in the wine cellar. And he would shrug, unaware that the answer was already behind the curtain. Let the music play. Let the lights dazzle. Let the toasts and laughter flow like champagne. I would not interrupt, not yet. I would let them bask in the illusion they created. But when the right moment arrived, when the candles dimmed and the applause quieted, when eyes turned to the screen and expected nothing but sentiment, I would be there. Not as a ghost, not as a guest, but as the architect, as the owner, as the man they erased from the list, but not from the story. And the story, oh, it was only beginning. There's something peculiar about ownership, something that eludes the eye of those who assume control, belongs only to those who shout the loudest or stand at the front of the room. True ownership doesn't parade itself. It doesn't wear a name tag or pose for photographs. It exists in silence, in the signatures buried beneath contracts, in the weight of a key that fits every door. In the way a man can sit outside his own house and still know that the foundation remembers his. Hence, a year before the night, I was turned away at the gate like a stranger knocking on a forgotten door. I had signed the papers, not out of spite, not out of foresight, but out of something more instinctive, a pull, a whisper in the quiet evenings that told me I needed to preserve something, anchor something in stone, while everything else around me floated away. The building had always been special. A quiet estate nestled near the water, with old pine beams and a warmth that you didn't find in most sterile party venues. I had known the owner, casually played chess with him once at the local Rotary Club, shared stories about our grandkids, drank thick coffee on a cold winter morning when neither of us could sleep. When he mentioned one day that he was thinking of retiring, I listened. When he said the business was too personal to be sold to just anyone, I made an offer. Not in my name, but through a holding company I'd set up years prior, clean, unobtrusive, quiet as a shadow. The paperwork passed unnoticed. The ink dried beneath the sound of holiday bells. I didn't even visit for the first 6 months. I let the place breathe, let the staff continue without interruption. I wasn't there to change the soul of the place, only to preserve it. When the event coordinator, my son's wife, hired, made inquiries about a venue for the Quinceañera, she, of course, stumbled onto this one. Elegant, within budget, with a reputation for flawless events. She booked it. No one asked questions. No one traced it back. Why would they? The company name meant nothing to them. Just a sterile brand, an umbrella beneath which a legacy quietly slept. It amused me, later, to realize they had praised the place openly during planning. Said it had taste and class. Said it was better than they expected. My son even joked, so I heard, that maybe they'd found a venue with standards finally worthy of the family name. I wondered if he realized, as he spoke, that the ceiling beams above which he would toast and laugh had been reinforced under my supervision, that the chandeliers his daughter would dance beneath had been chosen during my last visit. When I walked the halls in silence, hand resting on the walls like one greets an old friend, they would dance on floors I had paid to restore. They would eat from plates I had approved, and every server in that room would know me by another name. I hadn't asked for recognition. That wasn't the point. It was never about being seen. It was about being present in a way they couldn't deny when the time came. In the weeks leading up to the event, I kept my distance. I watched from a distance as my son's family gushed about the preparations. I heard about the playlist, about the menu: lobster ravioli, imported cheeses, sorbets between courses. None of them realized I had tasted the samples myself in a small room at the back of the building months ago. I had adjusted the seasoning on the lamb dish, had suggested the arrangement of the desserts. Even the color palette of the table runners, they thought it, was chosen by the planner. But she had simply nodded when I pointed at a swatch of burgundy and said, "This one. It reminds me of autumns that mattered." Every detail they applauded. Every element they believed they had curated it had passed through my hands first. And still, they had tried to erase me, as if removing a name from a list could undo the fingerprints left on every doorknob and napkin. When I was turned away at the gate, I didn't tell the guard, didn't pull rank. What would have been the point? There's a difference between revenge and poetry. The former is loud and petty. The latter is quiet and permanent. I chose the latter. I chose to let them walk through a night of celebration built on my foundation, unaware that the very walls echoed with my silence. Let them toast. Let them raise glasses in honor of themselves. The air they breathed was paid for by a man they refused to name. The dance floor they spun on had been ray-sanded 2 months earlier, because I had noticed the grain was uneven. I had stood in that room, in jeans and gloves, as workers moved around me, not giving orders, helping, watching, ensuring everything was perfect. Not for them, for her. For my granddaughter, who would one day look back on this night, her 15th birthday, and remember the light, the warmth, the strange beauty of a place where she felt surrounded by love. Even if she couldn't quite explain why, She didn't know I owned it. She didn't know I had signed the contracts, adjusted the schedules, walked the halls at dawn to ensure the heating was even. But she would know, one day, when the pieces fell together, when the truth, like water rising through floorboards, revealed the shape beneath the surface. And when it did, I didn't want her to think I had stayed away. I wanted her to know I had been there all along in every lamp, every flower arrangement, every carefully folded napkin. I had built the house of her memory. That was my gift, not to the family who tried to bury me in omission, but to the girl who still held a sliver of the past in her eyes, even if they tried to scrub it away. Let them forget. Let them pretend. Let them speak of ownership in terms of names on lists and voices in microphones. The truth was buried in the bricks, in the locks that clicked open only for me, and in the door that, when I chose to open it, would change everything. Because I wasn't done, not yet. The party had only just begun. There's a strange kind of intimacy in orchestrating something that will never carry your name. A form of invisible authorship, like writing a poem only one person might one day recognize as yours. That's how it felt. Building the banquet, not in a grand kitchen with a brigade of chefs clamoring for instructions, but in the quiet margins of preparation, months before the first guest would arrive, long before the invitations I never received were printed. I was there, in the soft hum of planning meetings where my presence was a whisper behind the curtain. I reviewed every menu. I signed off on the wine pairings. I adjusted the light dimmers for the exact tone of evening that would make the gold on the table shimmer without feeling ostentatious. I chose the chandeliers that would hang overhead, their crystal tears reflecting the laughter of people who had no idea whose eyes had approved them. I had sat with the chef, an old friend by now, going over each course not as an investor but as someone invested. The duck should be tender, not fatty. The risotto, creamy but not overbearing. The salad simple, elegant, uncluttered. A metaphor, perhaps, for what I had hoped my relationship with my family could have been. Something honest, without garnish. Something they wouldn't gag on. The irony was relentless. Every bite they would later praise. Every photo taken of their plates. Every glint of the candlelight of the silver forks, they were mine, in the quietest way possible. The decor was another layer. I worked with a florist known for his minimalism. I told him, make it feel like the forest at dusk, not a showroom. He brought moss and deep reds, clusters of wildflowers that didn't shout for attention, but whispered of care. I remember walking the hall with him late one night, the space still under renovation. I asked where the days would be. He pointed. I nodded and imagined her, the girl with the long curls and the laugh I hadn't heard in 2 years, standing there, laughing with her friends, completely unaware that her grandfather had chosen the exact shade of lace on the tablecloth that would fall beside her fingertips. I wasn't building a banquet. I was stitching memory into matter. And even though I wasn't invited, even though my name had been scrubbed from the narrative like an inconvenient stain, I was there. They couldn't see me, but I was there in everything that touched their senses. Music. My God, the music. My son had forwarded a list through the planner. He wanted hits. Loud ones. Songs that felt modern, that had no past. But I knew her better. Knew that somewhere, buried beneath the noise, she still loved old Italian ballads. I slipped a few into the set list. Quietly, not enough to draw attention. Just enough that, when one of them floated through the room at the right hour, she might pause, might feel something familiar, might remember the melody from the nights she stayed at my house, when I'd cook her fettuccine and we'd dance slowly in socks across the wooden floor. I didn't need credit. I only needed to remind her gently, softly, that I hadn't vanished, that someone still remembered her before the version of her they decided she should become. Every speaker in that banquet hall carried my memory to her ears, whether they knew it or not. The desserts were the final act. Not grand cakes piled with fondant, but delicate pastries, crafted with patience. I'd commissioned a bakery from a nearby town, run by a widow who knew how to make custard feel like a confession. I paid her personally in cash and asked her to make something no one would expect: a lemon tart with lavender cream, the kind my granddaughter used to sneak from the fridge when she thought I wasn't looking. When the tray would eventually appear at the buffet table, I knew she would spot them. I didn't know if she'd eat one. I didn't need her to. I just wanted her to see them and remember that someone had remembered her. I watched none of it from within the party. I sat in the operations office, in the back of the building. A monitor showed me the live feed from the cameras installed mostly for security, but useful for observation. I watched my son give his speech. He stood proudly beside his wife, both beaming as if they'd built this all with their own hands. I felt no bitterness then, only distance, like watching actors read a play I had written in secret. I didn't care that they didn't know the lines were mine. I only cared that the story still reached the right heart. And as the evening wore on and the wine began to dull their inhibitions, I saw the guests grow comfortable, careless. They toasted themselves. They clapped for speeches. They posed for photos near the floral arch I had approved. Not one of them noticed the hands behind the curtain. And that was fine, because they weren't my audience. She was. Only her. And I knew she'd see it eventually. A detail, a flavor, a glimmer of something familiar in the air. She'd ask someone where the tart came from, why that song played, who chose those flowers. And the answers would be vague. The planner, maybe, or coincidence, or they wouldn't remember it all. But she would, in a place beyond the noise. She would. And when that time came, when she realized that everything beautiful about that night had a silent thread running through it, she would pull it, and at the end of it, find me, not angry, not loud, not bitter, just there, as I had always been. And when I finally stepped through that door later, when the charade had played long enough, I knew I wouldn't need to explain anything, because the walls would explain for me. The food, the music, the scent of lavender and sugar in the air. All of it would say what my mouth no longer needed to. I was never gone. I was always here, watching, preparing, loving, in silence. Among the many quiet roles I orchestrated from the shadows of that night, the photographer was my most trusted presence. She wasn't from one of those big city firms with glowing portfolios and overexposed smiles. No, I found her tucked away in a town 2 hours east. A woman whose work carried a stillness that spoke to me, portraits that didn't scream but listened, that captured not just light but emotion, caught not just moments but the silent residue left in their wake. Her name was Lucia. She had eyes like the inside of an old cathedral, hushed, reverent, and profoundly aware. When I called her months prior and asked her to document a celebration, she thought I was just another client. But as I explained, in vague language lined with pauses and unfinished thoughts, that I would not be seen but would be present, that I would not be mentioned but was deeply involved, she listened. And then she simply asked, "Do you want the truth or what they want to see?" I answered her by sending the deposit the next hour, double her usual fee, and told her to send me everything unedited, unfiltered, untouched by the sanitizing hands of my son's expectations. From the moment the first guests began to arrive, Lucia's lens was watching not just the obvious joy, but the undercurrents. She moved through the crowd unnoticed, like a memory with a camera, while others posed beside the ornate centerpiece that I had personally selected, while they clinked champagne glasses and adjusted their dresses for symmetry. She captured the glances that lingered too long, the smirks that followed shallow compliments, the stiffness in my son's shoulders when he tried to appear at ease. She knew who to focus on. She photographed my granddaughter often not just smiling but thinking, gazing into the middle distance, as if waiting for something or someone to arrive. She captured a particular moment, one I would later stare at for what felt like hours, The girl half turned toward the door, while the laughter inside the hall pulled her back. Something in her posture spoke of expectation, as if some small part of her, buried beneath the carefully arranged curls and the blush on her cheeks, hoped I would be there, as if she hadn't entirely surrendered to the narrative my son had written for her. Lucia also documented the entrances, who came in, how they greeted each other, who looked around for familiar faces, and who avoided eye contact altogether. She took special care to photograph the moment the security guard at the entrance shook his head at me. Later, when she handed me that image, it looked like something from a film. The proud man in a suit, holding a wrap box, framed by the cold indifference of a younger man in uniform, one arm barring the way, while inside the hallway behind him, golden lights twinkled like the world had already moved on without me. She had taken it from a distance, but her lens had caught the detail on my face. I was smiling, not with joy but with quiet amusement. She said later that the image struck her because most people, when turned away like that, showed embarrassment or hurt. But I didn't. I looked like someone who already knew something no one else did. That was the gift Lucia gave me, not just documentation, but evidence of presence. Proof that even when erased from the guest list, a man could still be felt in the angles of the night. She captured my absence the way one captures a shadow, by showing the light that makes it visible. And she knew, better than most, the cruelty of being forgotten. In one of our early conversations, before she even knew my full story, she told me how her father had died the same year she'd finished photography school. Her family had hosted a memorial, but her mother had asked the priest not to mention his name, said it was easier for the younger relatives that way. Lucia hadn't argued. She just brought her camera, took pictures of the guests sipping wine beneath a photo of a man no one was allowed to mention. That's when I understood, she said. Photos can speak when people decide to stay quiet, and so she spoke for me. With her lens, with her silent walk through the hall, with a folder of images she sent me the next morning, each one a testament to the strange dissonance of a celebration built on a hidden foundation. My son, standing tall, his smile wide, yet his eyes scanning the room in brief flickers, as if looking for a ghost. My daughter-in-law, laughing a little too hard, gripping her wine glass like a weapon of status. My granddaughter, radiant but searching, her joy never fully rooted in the present moment. And then, the decorations, the food, the music, the silent orchestra I had conducted behind closed doors. All captured, all preserved, not to be displayed in albums or posted on social media, but to be kept in a quiet archive of truths no one had the courage to say aloud. When Lucia finally left the venue that night, she paused by the kitchen doors, where I stood just beyond the sliver of shadow. She didn't speak. She just gave me a nod, the kind given between people who have seen something through together. A nod that said, they won't thank you, but she will, one day. And then she was gone. Her camera still warm from the heat of the moments she'd stolen from a party that never wanted to remember its architect. But I remembered, and now, thanks to her, so would the world, in perfect clarity, frame by frame, truth by truth. There's a silence that only comes from being deliberately overlooked, a silence deeper than rejection, because it is not loud, not cruel, not dramatic. It is measured, practiced, and surgical, an erasure done not with fury but with calculated absence. That silence accompanied me as I placed the gift down gently at the reception table, beneath a cluster of over-decorated welcome cards and towering floral arrangements, each screaming a celebration I had been meticulously removed from. I didn't ask for attention. I didn't ask for acknowledgement. I only asked for the right to give. The box was small, neatly wrapped in silver paper, so understated it looked modest compared to the parade of branded gift bags stacked around it. But inside, it held more than a bracelet or trinket or designer perfume. Inside it lived a story, our story, mine and hers, encoded in a simple crest of the family. An heirloom so old its origins had already been blurred by time and translation, but never its meaning. The crest had been handed down to me by my grandfather, an object of humble weight yet impossible importance. It wasn't made of gold or jewels, but of carved wood, aged to a shade only decades of handling could achieve. On it were etched symbols so worn they seemed almost like wounds. A tree with broken branches, a sun hidden halfway behind clouds, and beneath it all, a line in Latin Memini Qui Sum, I remember who I am. My father had given it to me the week I left home to start a business that would eventually build everything my family now stood on. He had said, "When they forget you, remember yourself." It became my compass in years when the world tried to redraw my coordinates. And now, it belonged to her. Alongside it, I had written a letter, not with lofty prose or dramatic declarations, but with a voice I would have used if she were sitting beside me in silence, listening the way she used to when she was a child and thought I knew everything. I told her about the stories she loved, the ones about how her grandmother and I danced in kitchens instead of ballrooms, how the first office I ever rented had a leak in the ceiling and a rat that showed up every Wednesday. I reminded her of the times she fell asleep on my chest during thunderstorms, and how I'd always told her she was the lightning I never feared. I wrote about legacy, not as wealth or property, but as the things we pass on quietly, believing they'll bloom later when the soil is ready. And finally, I wrote that no matter who surrounded her now, no matter who edited the truth to fit the page they preferred, there was one person who had never stopped seeing her, not as a pawn in someone else's pride, but as a girl who once ran into my arms after every school recital and whispered, "Did I do good, Grandpa?" That box waited, silently, beneath the glimmer of chandeliers that I had chosen. Beside the guest book no one expected me to sign. The receptionist barely glanced at it. She was a young girl, busy managing last-minute calls and impatient guests asking about seating arrangements. I left it without fanfare, knowing it would be logged as gift no sender marked. I didn't need them to know. I needed her to feel it when the time came. Hours passed. Toasts were made. Speeches were delivered. Balloons rose. Dresses sparkled. People drank too much wine and told stories they didn't quite believe about how they watched her grow up. The box remained unopened. No one seemed curious. And yet, I watched it all from the service corridor, just beyond the line of view, like a ghost in his own cathedral, seeing every gesture, every missed opportunity. And that silence I mentioned before, it grew louder the longer the box sat untouched. Some part of me wondered if she would notice, if, through the haze of curated celebration and the well-rehearsed joy of people who performed love only when photographed, she might glance over and see it, feel it, even. That something was there for her, that not everyone had forgotten. But the night grew long. The music swelled. The cake was wheeled in with precision, and the box stayed right where I left it, too quiet, too modest, too meaningful for that room. But I didn't resent them, not then, not yet, because I had planted something, and some seeds take time. I didn't need them to open it in front of applause. I didn't want their gratitude, not when it came too late and dressed like obligation. All I wanted was for her to find it when the noise had died down, when the lights were off, when the mirrors no longer reflected approval but truth. I wanted her to find it when she was alone, or maybe sad, or simply wondering if anyone still remembered the girl behind the dress. And in that moment, maybe months or years from now, she would unwrap the silver paper, slide open the wooden lid, and find the past quietly reaching out to her. A crest, a letter, a memory not erased, a hand still held out in the dark. And maybe then, she would remember too. There's a moment in every celebration when the illusion crystallizes, when all the orchestration, all the pretending, all the decorations and curated smiles are stripped bare by something too raw to ignore. That moment is usually the singing of happy birthday For most, it's just a song, an inevitable ritual. For me, on that night, it was a trigger pulled with precision. The culmination of months of quiet orchestration I had designed not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. I remained hidden while the lights dimmed, watching the servers I had hired move through the hall with graceful efficiency, knowing each of them had been briefed, not on logistics but on silence. They didn't know the full story, only that their true employer was not the man giving speeches. At the main table, I stood in the corridor behind the service kitchen, one foot resting on a box of supplies, my eyes fixed on the monitor, showing the ballroom from 3 different angles. The candles on the cake flickered like beacons on a battlefield. And then it happened. The music cut. The MC, an overly rehearsed man with too much gel in his hair, grabbed the microphone and encouraged the crowd to begin. 1, 2, 3, they chanted. Then came the song. 80 voices lifted in harmony, their faces glowing with admiration for the girl in the lavender gown, her eyes reflecting the shimmer of the sparklers surrounding her multi-tiered cake. My granddaughter looked radiant. I didn't hate that. I wasn't there to take the night from her. I was there to return what had been taken from me. As the final note of the song dissolved into applause, the screen above the stage, seamlessly mounted by my team, under the guise of a technical upgrade, flickered. At first, it was mistaken for a lighting glitch. A few heads turned, confused. Then the room fell silent as the screen turned black. A soft piano melody faded in something delicate, personal, not part of the official playlist. It was the lullaby I used to hum when she was a baby, a piece I had recorded myself decades ago and stored away, never intending for it to be used this way. And then the words appeared, white letters on a black screen, elegant, precise, unassuming, yet loud enough to hush a ballroom. To the girl who changed my life the moment she opened her eyes. You may not have known I was here tonight. You may have been told otherwise. But I was here before the lights came on. I was here long before the stage was built. I was here in every brick, every plate, every moment that brought this night to life. A ripple moved through the crowd. My son shifted uncomfortably, his wife leaning in to whisper something into his ear. But the screen ignored them. It continued. Though I wasn't on the list, I never needed permission to love you. This place, this night, every inch of it was built by the hands of someone who never stopped seeing you. The final frame remained static for several seconds. Happy birthday, my granddaughter. With eternal love from the man they thought you'd forget. There was no applause, no immediate reaction. Just that heavy, uncomfortable silence that only truth can cast. A few gasps, a few stunned glances. But the loudest reaction came from her. She didn't cry, not yet. She just stood still, her hand resting lightly on the cake, as if anchoring herself to something real in a room that had suddenly lost all certainty. My cue was not planned for spectacle. I hadn't wanted to storm the stage or make anyone grovel. But something told me the moment had chosen itself, and it was time. I adjusted my tie, walked through the kitchen, past the dishwashers who gave me polite, nervous nods, and approached the door to the main floor. It swung open without resistance. The staff knew. They all knew now. I stepped in slowly, not to a standing ovation or to outrage, but to confusion. People recognized me but couldn't quite place why or how I belonged here. My son's expression contorted in slow-motion disbelief, like a man watching a ghost cross a threshold he thought was sealed. But I didn't look at him. I looked only at her, and for a few unbearable seconds, she looked at me, then past me, then back again, her lips parting slightly, as if caught between names. The room didn't matter anymore. The music had not resumed. The lights stayed dim, and I kept walking, my steps measured, not theatrical, not proud, just honest. I didn't smile. I didn't speak. Not yet. I simply arrived. I reached the edge of the dance floor, paused, and placed a hand lightly on my chest just once, then lowered it. It was enough that she knew. She stepped forward, slowly at first, then faster, her heels clicking against the floor like punctuation. And then, as if time snapped back into motion, she ran, arms around me, face buried against my shoulder, a sob muffled by the fabric of my jacket. Not dramatic, not performative, just a granddaughter clinging to the only version of the night that felt real. I closed my eyes. Around us, the crowd remained paralyzed in their assigned roles, unsure whether to resume their celebration or witness the rewriting of a narrative they thought was complete. I didn't care. The birthday song had played, the candles had been blown out, and the man who wasn't on the list had just taken his rightful place in the story. Not out of revenge, not to humiliate, but to remind her that presence, real presence, doesn't need an invitation. The echo of her footsteps fading into the fabric of my coat was the only sound that seemed to matter in that instant, as if the ballroom had willingly surrendered its voice to witness something it could neither explain nor interrupt. Her embrace lingered, small hands clutching at my shoulders with a quiet desperation that neither youth nor festivity could conceal. There were no cameras capturing the moment, no MC filling the void with platitudes, only a heavy, anticipatory stillness, a room full of eyes locked in suspended animation, waiting for the narrative to fracture further. I did not move. Not out of fear or hesitation, but because I knew that the silence was working harder than any speech ever could. And then, almost imperceptibly, the screen flickered again. The lights, dimmed for the birthday moment, remained low, casting the crowd in a soft chiaroscuro, as if the truth deserved mood lighting. The video resumed. A new image appeared, not graphics, not stock footage, not even text this time. Just a still frame, grainy but unmistakable. Me, standing behind the long buffet table in the days before the party, sleeves rolled, clipboard in hand, surveying the room like a builder appraising a house of his own design. Then, another clip, me walking through the floral shop, pointing to arrangements, choosing colors not based on trend but on memory, lavenders and creams, because those were the colors of her baby blanket, long since donated, but never forgotten. And then came the footage that turned the room's confusion into revelation. Me overseeing the DJ setup, adjusting the placement of lights, talking to the kitchen staff, even choosing the specific corner where the birthday cake would sit under perfect lighting. It was not vanity that had compelled me to document those moments, it was insurance. Proof that love sometimes exists in invisible labor, the kind that those in the spotlight conveniently pretend not to see. Faces began to shift. Some frowned, trying to reconcile the version of the story they'd accepted with the one now unfolding on screen. A few turned toward my son, whose posture betrayed the silent unraveling of his composure. He reached for a glass of water but missed it slightly, fingers trembling as they adjusted. His wife whispered something, but her voice was a ghost, barely a breath. The guest's family, friends, strangers watched not just the video, but the ripples it sent crashing through the walls of the story they thought they understood. And then came the final image on the screen. My granddaughter, maybe 4 or 5, sitting on my lap at a park bench, pointing toward a carousel. It was not a photo any of them had ever seen. I knew that because it was taken by me, during one of those quiet afternoons when I was the only one who had remembered to pick her up from school, when her parents were too busy or too forgetful or too something to be present. A single sentence appeared beneath that image. One line, white on black. Memories don't need permission to exist. The screen went black. The lights rose not all at once, but gradually, as if the ballroom were waking from a long dream. Conversations didn't resume. No music returned. Even the waitstaff froze, unsure whether to move or stay still. In that moment, the entire celebration had shifted from spectacle to courtroom. In truth, uninvited as it had been, had taken the stand. I felt her hand tighten in mine, not asking for guidance, but offering solidarity. We stood at the center of the room, the space around us now a vacuum of unraveling expectations. And then I took one step forward, not toward my son, not toward the stage, but toward the quiet podium where earlier that night he had thanked the guests for attending. It wasn't revenge that guided me, nor anger. It was the need to fill a silence that had existed long before this party. I reached the microphone slowly, brushing a hand across the polished wood of the stand, as if testing whether it still belonged to him, or if it had already been reclaimed by truth. No one interrupted. No one protested. I looked out over the crowd, not to condemn them, but to let them see me, not the father who had once been labeled inconvenient, not the man omitted from the list, but the architect of a moment they had tried to keep out of reach. I didn't clear my throat. I didn't raise my voice. I simply leaned in and spoke with the calm of someone who has waited too long to be heard. And as I prepared to speak the first word, the room leaned forward as one, not out of obligation, out of shame, out of awe, out of something deeper recognition. They had not turned because of noise. They had turned because silence had finally spoken. I didn't need to raise my voice, because the room had already lowered itself into an involuntary hush, the kind that only appears when a truth too heavy for politeness begins to make itself known. My hands rested gently on the podium, not trembling, not rigid, just still, like someone who had finally stopped fighting the current and decided to let it carry him wherever it needed to go. The microphone captured the texture of my breath before the first word even landed. I wasn't supposed to be here tonight, I began, each syllable steady, deliberate, not as a man asking for permission, but as someone who had nothing left to lose. The air seemed denser now, filled with unsaid apologies that hung between chandelier light and polished floor. My son, still standing near the center table, didn't move. His eyes bore into me, not in anger, but in paralysis. His hands clenched the back of a chair like he was holding on to the last familiar object in the room that had turned against him. I didn't mention his name. I didn't need to. The absence of his invitation had already filled the room with enough weight to sink any justification he might have prepared. Instead, I spoke of legacy, of building things no one clapped for, of showing up not just when the cameras flashed or the guests arrived, but when fevers needed checking, homework needed patience, and scraped knees demanded more than antiseptic, they demanded presence. I spoke of a granddaughter who once called me her hero for tying her shoes with bunny ears, and who now stood by my side, wiping quiet tears as if every memory was unspooling behind her eyes all at once. I spoke of love, not as performance, but as repetition, every ride, every bedtime story, every silent prayer uttered while driving home from a late-night school recital. And I made sure every word carried with it the weight of my own erasure, a quiet indictment of the man who tried to rewrite history by excluding its author. I saw it then, my son's shoulders slowly collapsing inward, his gaze breaking, his mouth parting like a man who had prepared a speech but suddenly forgot the language. The guests didn't look at him with pity or anger. They looked through him, not out of cruelty, but because truth, once revealed, doesn't share space easily with pretense. His wife reached out, perhaps to console or to anchor him, but he didn't react. The applause didn't erupt like it does in movies. It crept in, one pair of hands, then two, then the reluctant chorus like a tide that couldn't help but rise. I didn't bask in it. I didn't bow. I looked at my granddaughter and saw something deeper than validation recognition. A child who had been led to believe a narrative curated by convenience, now staring at the man who had lived the chapters that had been left out. My son sat down eventually, not because anyone told him to, but because standing had become too heavy a task. His seat, once the centerpiece of the night, now felt like exile. The tablecloth in front of him was creased where his fists had been. The water in his glass vibrated slightly, not from any sound, but from the tremor of hands trying to make sense of undoing. The guests resumed their meals slowly, conversations hushed, not out of discomfort but reflection. I returned to my place near the wall not to hide, but because I was no longer excluded. I was seen fully, not as an interruption, not as a problem, but as what I had always been, the man who gave more than he received, and who had learned that the deepest revenge was never rage or spectacle, but quiet truth spoken when everyone least expected it. As the night stretched on, I watched him avoid my eyes, avoid the buffet, avoid the glances of those who now saw him differently, not as the host of the evening, but as the man who had tried to cut the roots of his own story and failed. The silence that surrounded him wasn't mine to give, it was his to carry, and it clung to him like smoke that wouldn't clear, thick and inescapable, wrapping itself around every breath he took. He couldn't speak, not because he wasn't allowed, but because he knew that anything he said now would collapse under the weight of what had already been heard. Some truths don't need rebuttals. They simply settle into the room, like dust on untouched shelves, undeniable in their permanence. That night, I didn't win. I simply returned, and in doing so, I took back everything that had been quietly stolen from me. The microphone still felt warm from my touch, though it had been returned to its cradle, resting silently on the edge of the podium like a ceremonial object that had served its purpose. But the silence it left behind lingered with a pulse of its own, vibrating gently across the floor tiles and against the stiff-backed chairs that no longer felt as comfortable as they did at the beginning of the night. I didn't plan to speak again. I didn't come with rehearsed words or poetic vindications. But my granddaughter, eyes red from tears that hadn't dried but had transformed, placed her hand gently on my arm and whispered with a voice still soft but resolute, "Say something else, please." So I returned. I walked slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of intention. Each step an answer to every moment I had been erased. Each footfall echoing not with the weight of revenge but with the quiet gravity of truth finally allowed to breathe. When I stood again before the room, I didn't need to raise my voice. The air had already hushed itself into obedience. This time, I didn't speak of the past but of presence. I looked out across the guests, faces still caught between shock and reverence, and I told them this wasn't about anger. It was about remembering. I said that sometimes love doesn't look like balloons and banners or perfectly curated guest lists. Sometimes it looks like consistency, like sacrifice done in silence, like a man who shows up even when he's no longer invited. I told them this wasn't just a party. It was a mirror, a moment when everyone could see who had contributed and who had simply arrived. I spoke of lineage, not just the bloodline, but the lineage of care, of time, of the uncelebrated acts that make a childhood whole. I didn't name names. I didn't have to. The truths I spoke were wide enough to reach everyone who needed to hear them, and sharp enough to pierce only where guilt had already settled. My son sat motionless, staring at his lap, hands clenched around a napkin that had long given up its shape. His wife dabbed at her cheek with the corner of a tissue, not from tears, but from the crumbling of the performance they had built. Guests avoided his gaze now, not out of loyalty to me, but out of the quiet discomfort of realizing they had applauded an illusion. I turned toward my granddaughter then, not to perform but to honor. I told her that her beauty wasn't just in the dress she wore, or the makeup carefully applied, but in the way she had grown to ask questions no one wanted her to ask. I told her I was proud, not for choosing me in that moment, but for sensing what others tried to hide from her. I told her that no matter how hard people try to erase someone, love has a way of finding its own invitation back into the room. She cried again, not loudly, but with a kind of tremble that breaks generations of silence in a single blink. I didn't cry. I had already shed those tears years ago alone, in hospital corridors, beside birthday cakes left uneaten, in the shadows of courtrooms, and beneath the sting of unsigned Christmas cards. This night wasn't for grief. It was for clarity. I ended with one sentence, short, but heavier than the chandeliers above us. The man you forgot built the ground you're standing on. And then I left the microphone, not with a bow, but with a nod to her, to myself, to the version of me that had waited 15 years to exhale this truth. The music didn't resume right away. No one had the heart to press play again. The DJ looked uncertain, as if waiting for permission that could only be given by silence itself. When the song did come back, it wasn't the upbeat track they had prepared. It was softer, slower, like the room knew it had to shift its tone. I didn't stay to dance. That wasn't mine to reclaim. But I stayed long enough to watch her, my granddaughter, walk across the room, alone, toward the gift table. She picked up the small box I had left, the one with the family crest embossed faintly on the lid, and held it against her chest like she already understood what it meant, even before opening it. My son didn't move. He couldn't. The world he had tried to choreograph was unraveling, thread by thread, and all he could do now was watch. Guests approached me cautiously, hands outstretched, offering words like I didn't know or you deserved better, but I didn't need those either. I didn't come for applause. I came for presence, and I had reclaimed it not by force, not by spectacle, but by stepping into a room that tried to forget me, and reminding it that foundations don't disappear just because you stop acknowledging them. As the night faded and guests filtered out, the buffet lights dimming slowly, I stood near the exit, watching them leave one by one. Some nodded at me respectfully, some avoided my eyes, but none walked out untouched by what had unfolded. My granddaughter came to me last. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. She hugged me with the force of every unspoken moment we were denied, and in that embrace, I knew the night had served its true purpose. When I finally stepped outside, the night air was cool, not bitter. The stars above were quiet but awake, like old friends finally letting themselves be seen again. And as the doors closed behind me, I realized something I hadn't expected. I didn't need to be invited ever again, because now they all knew I had never truly left. I had simply waited, patiently, for the moment they could no longer deny I had always been there.